So I've been talking to Rob Jackson for a number of years since he found out that I was experimenting with this course. So most of today, usually I talk at a more theoretical level, but most of today is just the presentation of a course that we have developed. And as far as interaction with this, I can adapt if you have a question. If I look out and you want clarification about something, we can stop. The presentation's sort of made to be dialogical if you want it to be. So this is a course, just the basics of it. We currently do it in the first semester of our students' senior year. It's ungraded, and it's all of the seniors together in a fairly large environment. For us, that's 30 at some of our campuses, or at our other campuses, we would break them up. It would be still up to 30 in a class, but perhaps 2 courses. So the first thing I want to do is just give you a little background, and that involves first of all, the first portion of Trinity School's mission. The mission of Trinity Schools is to impart basic ordered knowledge about the world and to train students in basic intellectual skills and qualities of mind so that they might be of use to God in the wise care and governance of His creation and the building of His kingdom. This is the first half of our mission. The second half is how we do that. But I want to say this is a Christian mission, of course, but I think all of us have a desire for our students that they would do some sort of meaningful work in the contemporary world when they leave the confines of our schools. So whether that is something ordered towards citizenship or service or virtue, I think all of us in classical schools don't imagine that our educational impact is going to stop at that moment. So what happened with a mission like this is about 20 years ago now, our alumni came to us and said, we know a lot about Plato and Aristotle, but we know nothing about the world. And these were serious alumni. They didn't just want pop culture or current events. They didn't want us to change our curriculum. They were just legitimately coming to tell us that this notion of being of use to God in the world was hindered by our failure to connect our education for them to the world in which they were going. So what we were talking about at that point, we took their response very seriously, and we had to ask ourselves, how are we going to respond to this legitimate concern of our alumni, rooted in our mission and the high order utility of our mission? So usefulness is not a bad word. We do want our education to be useful in a high order sense. And how are we going to do that without giving in to the demand for mere relevance or contemporaneity? So there would be a way where you could maybe just say, hey, we need to talk more about current events or read more from the 21st century. To us, that would have been just a shortcut and probably still not accomplished what they were looking for. So what we did was had a faculty-wide conversation on developing a new capstone course, and it was going to slot into a very particular place in our sequence. And at the time the course was being developed, this was the height of the United States' influence in the world as a single superpower. So the questions we were addressing when we thought about, well, what do they need to know to be of use to God in the world, what was going on at the time was basically development in what was then called the Third World, battling the AIDS crisis, etc. And it appeared that if we were going to focus on them being of use to God in the wise care and governance of His creation, that was just kind of where it was at the moment. So we developed a course called World Issues, and it was intended to be entirely outside of the United States to give them a sense for the world outside many of their suburban backyards. And we worked on the content for a little while. It's worth noting that this is a very sort of wonky, I guess, intellectual piece of information, but we deliberately didn't call it current events or global issues because of a footnote on page 86 of Walker Percy's Lost in the Cosmos, where he distinguishes between an environment, which is something that is given to us, and a world, which is something that we structure and then live in. So the course was called World Issues, very importantly, to recognize that we're talking about structures that are built, structures that can be changed, and that's why we would think that you could have world-shaping activity. So the content of that first course, it was, as I said, focused on development in emerging nations. So we talked about health and well-being, food and medicine, economic development, the AIDS crisis, as I mentioned, difficulties accessing global markets, challenges of the extremely poor, and most of that was presenting them information with which some of them were unfamiliar. We also taught them, gave some attention to challenges of what it means to operate in an emerging nation, so challenges of their post-colonial reality. Some of the things we would cover: tribal, national, colonial dynamics, just giving them a sense that, when the Western nations came in and just drew lines, those lines did not necessarily correspond to natural divisions, and that created problems when those colonies were returned. Economic dependency, ethno-religious conflict, and then Western ideological alignments, the idea that some of these folks were lining up with what we would call the West, others with Marxist regimes. So, and I would say it was helpful. They learned a lot. Anything we did by way of solutions at that point was heavy on technical solutions. So mosquito netting, microfinance, market solutions. And that particular course, there was a lot of project-based research. We read some book-length works: Mountains Beyond Mountains, the story of Paul Farmer; Hernando de Soto's The Mystery of Capital; Wool Soyinka's Death and the King's Horseman. We watched some films like The Battle for Algiers, PBS documentaries called The Commanding Heights, which I would still recommend, actually. It's an economic history of the 20th century, and we still use it in the new course, too. So in terms of outcome, this is, when I say 1.0, the course I actually want to talk about is coming in a couple minutes, but why we switched it is important to the sort of course Rob asked me to talk about. So the pros of all of this: we did effectively make the students aware of things they had not been aware of. And we tied their education generally to some realities in the world. So the main message was, if you want to be helpful in the global situation, it helps to know how to think hard, it helps to understand politics, and it helps to know something, whether that's scientific or economic or, education is useful in the world. The cons, however, it didn't really connect to the rest of the curriculum. Honestly, it's very standalone, like nothing we did anywhere else. And that was not necessarily a problem, but it didn't exactly answer how does reading Aristotle have anything to do with what we just told you. And it produced actually quite a bit of, well, what could I ever do? So focusing on the issues of global poverty or the AIDS crisis, even if you gave really good solutions or told stories about heroic people who did amazing things, the students still came away often feeling like, well, that was just grim, and I guess I'm going to go to college and get a job that makes some good money because there's nothing else I can do. So then what happened, though, interestingly, when we had this course, was the next thing was course drift, unfortunately, and it was really interesting to watch. That original course produced some good results, but over time, doing the same course with different students, not all of them by any means, but enough of them to really shift the conversation, made the course totally different. So what were these new students like? Well, they were more socially aware or woke. So the things we were telling them already had a context for them that was very different than necessarily the context we were operating with. Some of them were already interested in causes or issues. So, a little standalone issue that you might, donate to or, like on a social media page or something. They were aware of all these causes that they had: desertification, some issues with poverty that they thought they understood. In many cases, their understanding was shallow, but pretty engaged and sometimes even very emotionally engaged. They were also preconditioned by social media in how they would understand the things we were talking about, and they were cynical about history. Now, history is no doubt messy, But for some of these students, it was simply a long series of oppressions merely. That's how they understood history. So talking about any positive development or change or an honest assessment of colonialism and post-colonialism, they just, somehow they had not, and that's not how we teach history in our classes, so it was very clear they're getting this from somewhere else. They were also negative towards many things Western, and I think a lot of us are familiar with that, even though we teach courses in the Western tradition. To some point, I will say this was also true of some of our younger teachers. So they also, depending on where they'd gone to school, what they thought, a couple of the thought leaders this weekend have made the point about needing to know what your teachers think and how they think. It was definitely true that some of them thought more like our students. So an approach that had previously worked, it was effective, had become ineffective, not because we changed it, but because the students in front of us changed. So we thought, well, if we're going to address that same question, we're going to have to do something differently to have the same outcome. Or maybe it's simply enough to say the world at the turn of the century is not the same as the world on the other side of so many of the upheavals we're aware of. So we designed the course pre-9/11, pre-Me Too movement, really the rise of social media, and it just hasn't been that long. But we realized we were going to have to change it. So we asked ourselves again, the curricular goal the goal that our curriculum is answerable to is what should an educated adult know in our time? What should they be able to do? What should they have thought about, et cetera? So when we asked the question, how is this course going to fit into that, we basically said they need to know the intellectual culture into which they are going. That is now their largest challenge in transitioning from a classical education to a typical college environment or classroom. The intellectual culture is what's totally disorienting to them. So we decided to reshape a course in terms of the intellectual features of the 21st century, and hopefully in a way that would meet some critical goals for us. So this is the World Issues 2.0. We had several goals for it. One was return to the founding vision of the course by connecting our mission with what we came to call world-shaping activity. Now that would also have been true when we were talking about issues in the developing world. That's definitely world-shaping activity. But we did think we needed to be more explicit about the intellectual aims so the students could understand it in the context of the rest of their education. So how is what we are doing here have anything to do with that original question of why do we read Plato and Aristotle and Locke? We also wanted to attempt to address cynicism in the students. And I will say, we knew right away we cannot do that by cynicism shaming. But we would have to find some way to provide a genuine, actionable optimism. Or as Rob was talking about it in the last plenary session, hope. So that was one thing we saw, that when they ran into these issues, they did not approach them as if there was actionable optimism or hope in which they could take one step forward. So that was something we wanted to address. We also wanted to just take head on the socio-political issues that had bred the cynicism in the first place. So we don't normally talk about, we kind of actually try and stay relatively far away from current events or issues in the rest of our curriculum. Not because they're bad, but because they're often a distraction from reading the text in front of us. But in this class, and before they left, we wanted to really take some of these things on direct. So the methodology of the course, we often present contemporary real-world problems. So articles, films, and I'll give you some examples of these in the various units, but this is sort of how the course works before what the content is. We found that book length works. The students were not reading them. Their homework was hard enough, and they were all applying to college, and so they would just skip on their ungraded colloquium reading. So it was a lot easier to just say, here's an article, read it, and write a 5-minute reflection. So they can read a short article, Showing films in class has been helpful, discussion, and then current events. We also do a lot of work with, what I'm saying here, guided development of hypothetical solutions. So we might put them in a group and say, imagine you're on a city council and the proposal is on the table for the city to purchase a hotel and use it to house the homeless. Here are some papers on similar projects and how have those turned out. Here's some data and a list of transcripts from the public meeting that was just held. You all discuss it, and at the end you're going to vote. So we might break them up into small groups, and then we come back and talk about that. We also give presentations on actual attempted solutions to some of the challenges in the world. So articles, presentations from local leaders, mostly experienced nonprofit leaders in the area, who can come in and give maybe a 30-minute presentation and then take some questions, like how do you interact with the government? How do you, what limitations are set on you? What do you do with failures? And then they have a lot of written reflections, so we don't do a lot of heavy lifting, no testing, no essays they get big grades on, but a lot of short written reflections, and then a final project that has a number of options to it. So the content now, the first thing is to deal with the question of what is a world. And without getting into its fourfold Heideggerian sense, which is behind the course but never presented to the children, you can get a sense for what we mean by that term just in its ordinary speech. So my wife and youngest daughter are here with me, and we just came from an event in New York this weekend. And while we were there, we were talking about who in the family could thrive in New York and who could not. And then we landed in Phoenix, and we're noting all the differences between Phoenix and New York. And you would say the world of New York is not like the world of Phoenix in many ways. They're differently constructed. I was talking to one of the security guards here, and you could also talk about the differences between the world of a classical education conference and the world of Comic-Con, which they just had a couple weeks ago. He said this is a lot easier to provide security for. The world of any suburb in the United States is probably more like a suburb 800 miles away than it is the inner core of the city that it is closer to. We talk about people struggling to live in two worlds, or what it means for someone's world to be rocked. So without going into the philosophy, they can actually understand, oh yeah, I know what it means to live in two worlds, to go to my youth group on Wednesday night and then come to school on Thursday morning and go home after school. Those are different worlds. So the next thing we talk about is how are those worlds changed and preserved? And this unit prepares them to understand words like conservative and progressive, not as two party platforms or ideologies, though you can use them that way, but to understand that beneath those is a question of preservation and change in the worlds in which you live. And very, very few people want everything to stay the same, and very few people want everything to be changed. We seem programmed to want to keep what we like and change what we want to change. We also, in this section, talk about the preservative value of institutions, traditions, authority, laws, rules, and even the boundedness of worlds. So exclusion is, of course, to exclude somebody from something right now is an intrinsically negative thing for most people. But we try and show them that you can't have a Hispanic Businessmen's Association unless it's only Hispanics who you're promoting. Like, it's the nature of the world that you're defining there. That doesn't mean that's an intrinsically racist endeavor. And then we translate that to families, and so we just talk about what preserves a unique world. And we do some intellectual exercises in how history has developed and political organizations have changed. The next thing we talk about is what happens when worlds fall apart. And this is probably the turning point in the course for them. The first thing we do is watch LA 92, which is a raw footage documentary with no voiceovers and no interpretation. Obviously, putting things together is interpretive, but it's pretty fair, of the Rodney King beating, the trial, and the aftermath. And as they're watching the movie over the course of 4 days, gradually their default categories are just sort of going away because we're asking them to take notes, to look at the different worlds they see. How do they interact? How are they breaking down? Where is there a failure of community or intersection of communities? And one of the ones they always note is after the verdict comes out and the LA is starting to get very restless that first night, there's raw footage from inside the AME church that's right down there. And there's an ecumenical service where people are calling for peace, justice and peace, but saying turn the other cheek, don't go do anything. And they switch right away to a sidewalk right outside the church, and some young people are saying, they're in there talking about peace, and every time we talk about peace, we get a foot up our ass. And so you see this, oh boy, that's two different worlds, two different approaches, and they're about to be in tension. So it's a very powerful moment in the class. And then we read an article called What the Left and the Right Get Wrong About My Neighborhood by somebody from Baltimore. And that is just a dynamite. After that, they're usually very seriously engaged in thinking, oh, this is more complicated than I thought, but there's a lot to talk about here. From there, we move to the features, 3 features of the 21st century world that were born in the 20th century. So one is increasing secularization. So each of these units is relatively long. So we describe it also in factual terms, not polemical. So we're simply talking about the reality of political secularization and cultural secularization. So, it's very important to us early on that we not finger wag or talk about, how much better it was before, because the point of the course is to be optimistic about how one operates now, not to wish for how things were like before. So with cultural secularization, for instance, we talk about things like, I don't know if this is a common term. How many have heard of the naked public square? Almost no one. See, this is true of my students as well. It was an idea that came out of First Things, maybe, it's probably 20 years now. I'm feeling old, but it was the idea that there are 2 ways to have secularization and religion. One is to say nobody gets to say anything. So that's the naked public square where you don't get to talk about religion. The other is the crowded public square, where you have, you have the creche next to the menorah, next to the Satanist statue that they always put up anytime you try and do things like that. So we talk about the differences, the advantages and disadvantages of those 2 approaches. We talk a little bit about the personal aspect of this from Charles. We don't read Charles Taylor, but we talk about the ideas he expresses from a secular age about what it means to live in a world where your belief is always contested. It's just, if you are a Christian, you always know at the same time that there is another option. Unlike, 100, 200 years ago where it would have been difficult not to be a Christian, now it's more difficult to be, in a certain sense. We also talk about the rise of the technological age. This is the one that is the most popular for them. So this is another big turning point. So we do introduce them to some of the most cutting edge stuff: robotics, artificial intelligence, material science, genetic engineering. And they do a project trying to combine these to say, what would you imagine, in 20 years, imagine what a fire station will be like, putting together all the innovation you see going on. And then, so it's kind of that's a fun gee whiz thing, and ChatGPT dropped right in the middle of this section when we were doing it this year, so we just switched right over. We're going to spend 2 days on ChatGPT and figure out what's going on. But the technological age is not just about technology, but about the fact that we think differently because of the power of technology. So just like secularization, this technological age comes with a way of thinking that is reflected in something like, if we have a hurricane and a levee breaks, our first response is not, this was an act of God we must deal with. Our first response is, what did we fail to do and who is to blame? And so our technology and science is so powerful now that we just assume if something bad happens, it could have been stopped. And that's true of medicine, personal health, all sorts of things. Finally, we talk about globalization and post-colonialism, just like the other one. We do an overview of the history, some current socioeconomic realities, implications for things like human rights, and in some ways, some of the things that so as I said, we're a Christian school, some of the things that are a legitimate stain on the history of Christianity that were done during this period, we have to be honest about them, or they won't believe us. So coming near the end here, at the end, there's two other features, and then I'll open it up to questions. We actually get to, okay, so what about you? What is your existential situation? And I explain them what that means. Who are you, and what is it like to be you? And I will tell them, I don't know. You can answer that far better than I can. I'm from a generation, in some ways, worlds removed from you. The world in which I grew up is not the world in which you grew up. And I'm not 100% sure what it's like to live in the world having grown up as you do. Now, having done this a few times, I'm pretty sure I'm going to get similar answers. But it starts out very Socratic. And some of the things that almost always come up, they don't come up in these terms, but I'm going to put them up here in very academic terms. They are very accepting of expressive individualism. So they all know you do you. And they know that they're supposed to carve out an identity and they're supposed to find themselves. But they feel it as a tremendous burden. And if you can just articulate it to them, like, yeah, that's a burden, and here's kind of where it comes from. Here's the ocean in which you swim is why you have these kind of challenges that I did not, or that I did not growing up. So they're eager in trying to discover or understand, some sort of viable self or an authentic person, but they're often doing so with no authoritative guide. Christian Smith wrote a book, it's now also old, Soul Searching, the Religious and Spiritual Lives of American Teenagers, I think in 2005, and he said all their sociological research indicates that parents think they're communicating to their children. I think this is true of teachers too. We think we're passing on a tradition, and they're smiling and nodding, and they're just conflict averse. And they're really getting a lot of their stuff from YouTube or Google or TikTok. And so this has actually been helpful to talk to them about it. Because if they know that you know what they're going through, it opens up some great conversations. They are also aware of a sense of loss in what used to be like stable families, 50-year anniversaries, ethnic, they watch movies about an ethnic identity that seems thick and rich, and they realize they don't have that. But they're cynical of those values as well, because they were constrictive in many senses. So they're a bit torn. Sometimes they're enthusiastic for these utopian visions of the world, like if we can just overcome X, then the world will be a bright and beautiful place, but they really have no idea how to put one foot in front of the other. That's increasingly true given the rise of what we would call cancel culture. They're just terrified. So I will talk to some of them individually and say, hey, you have great ideas in your reflections. Why don't you say that in class? I am not saying that. I'm not saying that in class. Why? Yeah, I'm not saying that in class. I will, yeah. So that is a burden for them. So one of the things we do to finish off, and then I will take some questions, we want to make sure they leave knowing what you could do. Like there's all this anxiety and burden of who am I and what do I want. We want to make sure they at least get some proposals. And this was a counter to the old challenge of, you probably, most of you will not solve the problem of the AIDS crisis in Africa. So what could you do? One thing that we've done is to switch from the old mantra of think globally, act locally to think locally, act locally. Look around at the world in which you live. Look for challenges to solve in the worlds you are already a part of. So you don't have to think about going into the wider world or whatever. What about your soccer team? What about your class? What about the school? Your seniors, what do the 8th graders need? What could you do to improve the world you're in? Engage in local politics. It really is just not that hard. And actually, you'll be a rock star. If you show up as an 18-year-old to a local political event, you're on the fast track already. So we make sure they know that. You could work for a nonprofit, or you could start one. Some years we've had them research what it takes to start a LLC or a nonprofit, just to see how easy it is. And then finally, we wanted to, and this has been a problem for a lot of our students when they go to colleges, they don't know how to foster informal community. And a lot of them are what David Brooks called the organizational kid. So they will join things and they will participate in them, but they have no idea how to start something, and they have a little fear of doing so, even if it's informal. They tend not to be very entrepreneurial. They've been in clubs since they were 4. So I remember one student coming to me when I was head of school and saying, "Can we start an ultimate frisbee club?" I said, "Why don't you just go to the park and play ultimate frisbee?" And why are you asking me for a club for this? And it was they had never thought, we get 10 of my friends and pass out some flyers and go to the park. Similarly, they asked me if they could start a philosophy club. I said, listen, if you do, I have to oversee what you read because the parents will call and, wonder why you're reading Nietzsche. So why don't you just go to the coffee shop with a bunch of you and read Nietzsche? I might even show up, but don't ask me to start a club. Anyway, pet peeve. So we wanted to give them a sense of you're an agent in the world and it's not that hard. I'll wrap this up here quick. Also, what can an 18-year-old do to shape the world long term? So this is the sort of our final word to them about our education and what it might prepare them to do. Ask any immediate questions in the context of permanent questions. So we can tell them mostly what we've been asking here are permanent questions about permanent things. Don't forget that when you get to college and go to your first rally about your first political event. Put it in context. Never give in to sloganizing or bumper sticker solutions. That's cheap. You've been trained better. Don't do that. If people around you are doing it, don't do it. Just step away. And don't forget about truth, beauty, and goodness while engaging in questions of practical politics and world-shaping activity. So that is, and occasionally we'll end with, also last thing, and then I'll take some questions. Occasionally we will end with a case study that brings all these different things together. So as controversial as it is, so my goal in doing this, one goal, when I knew we could make this work, if I could talk about transgender issues without people being inflamed and everybody being honest, the class would have succeeded. Because those are some of the things people are the most terrified to talk about. And sure enough, by the time this was my 5th year through it, we can have an open, honest conversation about how a phenomenon like that would be the result of secularization, the technological age, and other things. And we can just step back and talk about it. And I can say, look, you're all going to have to make decisions about how this world is shaped. And I'll give you some of my perspectives, but you need to understand where these things come from. They don't just pop up out of nowhere. So they get an intellectual history for some of the current events they would engage. So that's the course. Any questions? I realize that's like a fire hose of a course. I told Rob that would be the case, but. They told me to tell you to go to the mic because it's on video, but.
So I'm curious how you, it sounds like you're teaching it from the way you were saying it. I'm curious how you would go about appointing a teacher to that position. That's got to be a very particular person.
As all good questions do, they anticipated my last slide. It is a very difficult course to teach. And our main conversation is, how do you, like, do we have to have the whole faculty have read? I mean, we're a very kind of literary faculty. We read a lot of stuff together. But it is a very difficult course to teach. You kind of have to know most of their education, the things they've been talking about. You have to be very dialed in to teen culture. You have to have your ear to the ground to know, what's going to make you sound like an idiot and what are they actually thinking about. And you have to be halfway pastoral and halfway Socratic. It is not an easy course to teach. It's probably the number one thing we've thought, like, how would we do this? And I'm just now to the point of writing a curriculum with unit guides, but very difficult course to teach.
So I just want to clarify and ask a question. Your students don't actually do like a capstone project or something to make, a difference in their local community. Is that correct?
It's not a service-oriented thing.
Okay.
We entertained that.
Yeah. I just
We
wondered
decided not to do it.
not to do it. Tell us
Not
about that.
because we thought it was bad.
Okay.
That was probably the other leading option way back 20 years ago, was whether we would do a service project. We ended up doing the other.
My question may be a misunderstanding, but is this a semester course or a full year course?
It's a one-semester course. The one semester, 5 days a week, 1 hour at a time. Why is it a one-semester course?
No, why don't you do why did you decide not to do a service? Why did your kids not engage in some kind of service?
Yeah, this is going to be a philosophical point. We seriously thought about that, and so it's almost like a point of conscience to require them to serve. And I know that is not anybody else's, it's not anybody else's necessarily problem. We just sat down and said, I don't know if we can make people do charitable work. Now, a lot of our students are involved in that, but just for us, it seemed like we need to keep this intellectual. And we had some people who were strong supporters of the service project, so it was almost a 50-50 split. And the people who wanted to do the service project were pretty disappointed that we didn't.
I worked in an international development organization for a long time before I moved into education. So my question is, how are you cultivating and preventing kind of the savior mentality that you can come out with, and reading books like When Helping Hurts and things like that? How are you doing that, if at all, in this course?
Well, when we moved away, and I should have been a little more clear, there's very little. Let me go back a little bit to the content. We address it directly when we talk about globalization and post-colonialism. We directly address the whole savior complex thing. So we watch a couple of films that are relevant to that, read a couple of articles. When this was the major component of the course, we would read some examples of when that goes wrong, when you just don't listen to people on the ground, when you're not responsive to people's needs and you just come in with an idea. The most prominent one that all the kids got was, we're all going to get together and get a bunch of leftover uniforms and send them to Haiti because people don't have enough clothing, not realizing in doing so that one of the most significant industries in Haiti was people making clothes. So you're basically just canceling, somebody's way of life and means of living. Now, unfortunately, that was one of the things that made them grim and depressed, because they want an easy solution where they can send a uniform off to Haiti and help out, and it was very difficult for them to hear that it's just not that easy. A lot of the speakers who come in are also very good on that point, because anybody who's actually engaged with it knows that doesn't work. I'll even ask them sometimes, so, you just told a very nice story about, someone who came out of homelessness. Tell us the other stories. And what's this work really like for you? Is that enough of an answer? Yes. Yeah, so we take it head on. Anything else?
If this is too personal, you can ignore the question, but how have you personally been changed as a human being through teaching the course?
You know, I have developed a considerable, I'll just be blunt. The woke students who were trapped in TikTok and YouTube used to make me irritated. And now I am empathetic and I understand some of the things they're struggling with. I mean, having worked with them for 5 years in this environment, I'm just much more empathetic to the situation of our graduating seniors and the challenges they face. And conversations like that of talking with somebody who doesn't want to talk, who has great ideas, but they're terrified to talk because they're terrified of cancel culture. And that's also an environment in which out of that class, developing a relationship with students, I started talking to them more about, so tell me what your life on social media is like. And that was where I learned many of them don't really have a life on social media, but they have a group text that, and I've started telling parents this, like if you want to know why your children are anxious, I used to go home at 3 o'clock, and if there was drama at school, I would go fishing, and that was that. You know, I had 8 hours to just sort of debrief. They go home, and that drama goes on to the group chat, and that group chat is often vulgar, nasty, mean, and if the group chat is not vulgar, the spin-off chat that you are terrified you might not have been invited to because they're talking about you, and then they come back into the conversation. That's just, I am very, number one thing was empathy for their situation in the contemporary world. So, and that's a grim note to end, which is always one of my, my Achilles heel is grimness. So, but long term, I will say that, despite that empathy, long term, one of the values of this course has just been a place where it's appropriate for us to talk about their situation. And long term, I am actually more optimistic that they are, I said this in another panel earlier, there's a chance that they will be advocates with us against some of these things that we're maybe against, as long as they know we know how hard it is for them, and that we are really there to help them with their situation, not make them do something we want them to do. So on that note, thank you very much.